We're making view A, so we're going to do the front collar facings. So finish the unnotched edge of the front facing by turning under 1/4 of an inch in edge stitching. So we're going to fold under here and stitch down through our fold. So we're doing a turn and stitch edge finish. Then we're going to stay stitch around the neck of the facing. We're going to finish the edge of our front facing by, we're going to turn it under 1/4 of an inch. So we're doing a turn and stitch edge finish. And we're going to do that to both of the front facing pieces along the long edge of the facing. To finish the edge, we're going to stitch the folded edge down using a regular stitch length. We're going to back stitch, and then we're going to stitch down the folded edge of our facing. When we get to the bottom, we're going to back stitch. And we're going to do that for both of our facing pieces. We're going to stay stitch around the notched edge of our front facings. So stay stitch is regular stitch length at 3/8 of an inch. And we're going to do that for both front facings. We're going to apply the collar facing to the front neck facings. The collar facing is the collar piece that we applied the inner facing to. So we're going to pin right sides together, matching our notches and circles, and then we're going to stitch across the seams to sew the facings to the collar. We're going to pin our front facings to our collar facing. Our finished edges are to the inside. We're going to line up the edge of our collar and the edge of our facing. We're going to match our notches. And then our facing and our collar don't line up because the facing is curved. So we're going to clip the facing to the stay stitching so that it will spread out and match the shape of the collar. So now with it clipped, we can spread it out and pin it to be the same shape as the collar. And we're going to do that to the other side of the collar as well to put on the other facing. So we're matching our notches. And then we're going to clip our facing to the stay stitching so that it will spread to match the shape of the collar. We're going to stitch the front facing to the collar facing, a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So we're going to line the edge of the fabric up with the 5/8 inch mark. We're going to back stitch. And then we're going to sew across to the other edge of the front neck facing. And then we're going to back stitch. And we will do that for the other facing. We're going to back stitch, sew across, when we get to the edge, we're going to back stitch. After sewing the collar facing to the front facings, we're going to press the seam open, and then we're going to fold up the bottom edge of the collar 5/8 of an inch, and then we're going to trim that to 3/8 of an inch. After you've sewn the facing to the neck facing, on the bottom edge of the collar that's going to attach to the neckline, we're going to turn up the bottom edge of that 5/8 of an inch, and we're going to pin that all the way across the bottom edge of the collar. Then once we've done that, we want to trim that seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch so that we reduce the bulk when we have both seam allowances laying on top of each other in the finished garment. This is called grading a seam. So we're going to mark 3/8 of an inch from the folded edge all the way across. And then we're going to cut along that line. So you can actually press before you cut, or you can unpin it and then pin it back. So we're just going to cut off that seam allowance to 3/8 of an inch. And then I have my fold line that's still there, so I'm going to pin that back up. To sew the facings to the jacket, we're going to pin the collar facing and neck facing to the jacket with right sides together, and then we're going to stitch along the upper edge of the collar. To sew the facing to the jacket, we're going to pin the collar facing to the collar at the top of the collar. So we're going to line up the center front and the edge at the top of the collar. And we're going to pin all the way across. And go to the other edge. We're going to line up the center front, and our zipper is extended out so this is the same size as the under collar. And so we pinned across the top of the collar. To sew the facing on, we're going to sew from center front to center front across the top of the collar. We're going to use regular stitch length. We're going to back stitch. We're sewing a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Turn the collar and facing to the wrong side of the jacket, or the inside of the jacket, and we are going to fold the edge of the collar and facing in so that we are just to the inside of the zipper teeth. Then we are going to stitch the facing down around the zipper and around the bottom of the collar at the neck with a hand hem stitch. We're going to use a blind hem stitch so that we do not see our threads or our stitches. After sewing the facing to the collar, we're going to now finish applying the facing by turning the facing to the inside of the jacket. And we are going to start with the collar. We're going to match our circles to our seam allowances, and we want to lay the facing of the collar down so that we get the seam that we've sewn as a nice, good, flat fold. And then the edge that we've turned up the seam allowance should just overlap the seam where we sewed the collar to the neckline of the garment. And we're going to pin that down along the collar of the garment. We're just covering the stitching line, so when it's pinned down, you should not be able to see the stitches from where you sewed the collar to the jacket neckline. When we get to the other side seam, make sure that our side seam lines up with our dot. Then we'll do the same thing around the front of the collar. When we get to the front of the garment, the center front, the facing is going to come down. We're going to turn under the edge of the facing so that it lays flat but misses the teeth of the zipper. We want to cover the stitching from where we sewed the zipper down, but we want to just barely overlap that stitching so that we allow room for the zipper pull to be able to come up and down to be able to open and close the zipper. And we're going to pin that down the length of the garment. The width of our facing going down the front of our garment should be the same width down the entire center front. We're going to do that to the other side as well. So pin the remainder of the collar. And then again, when we get to the center front, we're going to fold the seam allowance back so that we just cover the row of stitching from stitching the zipper on, and the collar lays flat. And then we're going to do the same thing down the front facing of the jacket. Just covering that stitching line from sewing the zipper in. To stitch the facing down, we're going to use a blind hem stitch. So you're going to need to get a hand needle, and you're going to make a single thread with that. And then you are going to start, doesn't matter if you start at the top or the bottom. I'm going to start at the bottom. You're going to go through your facing. We just want to tie that off, and then you're going to pick a stitch in the zipper, and then you're going to come back up, and you're going to move over about 1/4 of an inch inside the fold of the facing. So you're going to go into the facing, with your needle, and then you're going to come back out about 1/4 of an inch over. And then you're going to make another pick in the zipper. Then you're going to go back into the facing. Move your stitch over inside the fold of the facing so we don't see the stitch. You're going to come back, make another pick in the zipper. And you're just going to continue that process all the way up the facing, stitching it down, making sure that you just cover the stitching line from where we sewed the zipper in so that you don't see that stitching line. And when you sew your hem stitch, we shouldn't be able to see any stitches on the garment. So everything should be hidden in the fold of the facing as you move over 1/4 of an inch to your next stitch. And then you should just be taking a very small pick in the zipper so that we don't see those stitches. And you're going to go all the way up the front of the jacket. When you get to the end, you need to tie off your thread. To do that, you will just go underneath and make a loop. Pull your needle through that loop and make a knot. And just do that a couple times to actually tie off your thread. So I'm making a stitch, I'm making a loop, I'm pulling my needle through that loop, and then pulling tight to make a knot. And you can cut your thread off. So now when we have stitched that down, we should not see any stitching on the inside. You also should not see any stitching or picks on the outside or the right side of the garment either. After you finish stitching the facing on one side, you'll do the same thing to stitch the facing on the other side of the center front at the zipper. To stitch the collar facing down, we're going to use the same blind stitch that we used to stitch the front facing. We're going to start where the front facing and the collar are sewn together. So we're going to take a stitch. We're using a single thread, just like we did when we sewed the front facings. We're going to start our thread there, and then we're going to use that blind stitch again, just going through the facing to move over, and then picking a yarn from the jacket, and then moving over, then picking a yarn and moving over. You're going to do that all the way around the neck to sew the facing of the collar down to the jacket. When you sew around to the other side where the facing and the collar attach, you'll need to tie off your threads to end that. So we're going to make a stitch through, we're going to make a loop, pull our needle through the loop, and tie it down to make a knot in our thread. And we'll do that a couple times to actually secure that thread. Then you can cut your excess thread off. When you're done, you should not be able to see any stitches on the inside. You should not see any stitches on the outside either. And your collar facing should cover the row of stitching where the collar was attached to the jacket, so that you don't see that stitching either.